Hi, this is Liz, friendly neighborhood reference librarian and cinephile, and this is October, and it's time for horror. Welcome to October, the most wonderful time of the year for horror hounds. In fact, I'm going to a horror marathon this weekend. I consider the horror fandom to be one of the most accepting of all fandoms. No one ever accuses you of being a fake horror girl, which nice contrast to the more toxic fandoms. So why do I constantly hear the question, how can you like horror? It's so degrading to women. First off, the framing of that is flawed. It's similar to the rap is sexist towards women argument. Yes, there are some songs that are gross, but rap, number one, has a long history of empowered women. Plus, there are rock songs that are just as misogynistic. Also, the entire discography of John Mayer and Maroon 5. Horror does have a spotty history with women. Look at all of the damsels in distress from older horror movies. However, that was par for the course for a lot of movies made in the 40s and 50s. Women are sexually exploited in horror? Well, welcome to all of cinema. Last I checked, Tango in Paris is not a horror film. And for all of its flaws, I find that horror is the one genre that consistently shows and even honors women's strength. And I am going to give you some great examples. I should note that just for the sake of time, I'm going to be sticking to US examples. First up, old school. As I mentioned up top, horror cinema, particularly in the 50s, 60s, pretty dismal for women. You existed to scream and be kidnapped by monsters. However, women did get to have fun in creature features, and I don't just mean the stuff like Bride of Frankenstein. The 1942 film Cat People starred Simone Simon as a young woman who believes she's part of a race of shape-shifting cats. Sounds fun. The film plays with you and keeps you guessing as to whether or not she's right. And, as with so many movies back then, the shape-shifting was an allegory for passion and sex. Older horror movies allowed for women to be emotionally fragile, but in a way where they weren't immediately dismissed as crazy. And while they may be dismissed in universe of the movie, the film itself is on their side in their fears that something might be wrong. A great example of this is in the film The Haunting. Based on Shirley Jackson's story, Julie Harris stars as a young woman who is convinced that there's a supposedly haunted house that's out to get her. And while the movie is kind of technically ambiguous, there's enough of a hint that she was right about the supernatural force. The same is true for Deborah Kerr in The Innocents. Though that movie is a little bit more explicit about the supernatural, we also have Catherine Deneuve in Repulsion, Mia Farrow in Rosemary's Baby, Catherine Ross in another Ira Levin adaptation, The Stepford Wives. These movies don't write these women off as merely hysterical. In fact, in all of these cases, the women were right that something was wrong, but were written off by characters in the film. And this is a theme that we see repeated with women in horror even today. Now, the late 70s and 80s gave us the slasher movie and the rise of exploitation, my love. But it also gave us some iconic heroines in Final Girls. For those who don't know, a final girl is exactly how it sounds. The final person standing, usually a lady, who defeats the main antagonist. I can't list them all, but I'll list a bunch. Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode, who keeps her wits about herself while fighting off Michael Myers in Halloween. We have Sigourney Weaver as Ripley, the only survivor of the Nostromo. And really, they all would have lived had they listened to her in the first place. And plus, she saved that cat. Jessica, played by Zora Lambert, a fragile woman who survives a breakdown and the supernatural in Let's Scare Jessica to Death. We have Sally, the late Marilyn Burns from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who jumped out of a second-story window when cornered by a family of cannibals and kept running. Nancy Thompson of Nightmare on Elm Street, who bravely went into Dreamland to defeat child killer Freddy Krueger. Fun fact, I have met Heather Langenkamp. Camille Keaton, who kills all of her attackers in I Spit on Your Grave. Fun fact, I've also met Camille Keaton. Underrated heroines Regina and Samantha Belmont, who fight off teenage mutant comet zombies and a sinister think tank in Night of the Comet. Oh, and yes, fun fact, I've met one of them, Kelly Maroney, who was also the final girl in the movie Shopping Mall. These women have survival instinct, a far cry from standing there while screaming while being slowly approached by a mummy. My favorite from this era, though, is JoBeth Williams in Poltergeist. Her character, Diane Freeling, is a housewife, traditionally a character that's passive, your damsel archetype, if you will. Her character is a great subversion in that she's far more active when her daughter disappears. Her husband is almost despondent, trying to deal with what's happened, while she's fascinated by the spirits that live in her house. She's the only one that goes to the other side to retrieve her child, and by the end of the movie, she's the one who faces off with a bad spirit and gets her kids out of the house. And that's after falling into a pit of skeletons. Worst pool ever. The 80s and the aughts, or 90s and the aughts. Unfortunately, the 90s and the aughts weren't that great for women in horror. The 90s weren't really great for horror to begin with, in my opinion, but we do have some great female roles. Jodie Foster is one of the few women to win Best Lead Actress for a horror role as Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs. And hey, while she doesn't make it to the end, Virginia Madsen does go toe-to-toe with Tony Todd in Candyman, and her character has dimension and agency. There is Sidney Prescott in Scream, of course. Wes Anderson gave us the 90s take on the final girl. And even if I think the movie isn't great, Jada Pinkett Smith deserves a shout out for being a good lead in one of the few black final girls in Demon Knight. My 90s favorite has to go to The Craft, a movie about 4 outcast girls who form a coven and gain powers. Very important movie to teenage me, and film that inspired a generation of witches. Even in a wasteland, there's some water. The aughts were a little better, but only had a few standouts. The female hiking horror The Descent, May, a movie about a girl who literally makes friends, the entire female cast of Dead Proof, the wonderful movie Teeth. Really, if you haven't seen Teeth, see it. It's about a girl who has fanged nether regions. The Dawn of the Dead remake makes Sarah Polley's character smart and resourceful. A real bright spot for me is Selena from 28 Days Later. She's tough, willing to put a machete in you if she thinks you're infected, and was smart enough to raid a pharmacy and a few stores for supplies. She keeps her head on a swivel and never succumbs to the damsel stereotypes, even when the movie looks like it's about to go there. I just wish it didn't take Americans another decade to realize how great Naomi Harris is. At least she finally got some acclaim for Moonlight. The other stellar entry of the aughts is Ginger Snaps, a great fable about puberty and sisterhood. And werewolves. I don't want to give away too much, just that Catherine Isabel is a horror royalty and we really should respect her as such. So before we go into modern day horror, I'd like to highlight some female villains. Women are not just victims or the heroes in horror. In some cases, they are the perpetrators of said terror. Jason was not the killer in the first Friday the 13th. His grieving mother was. Kathy Bates won an Oscar for playing Annie Wilkes in Misery. And The Bad Seed is both a camp classic and a great exercise in the creepy kid horror genre with a 10-year-old Patty McCormick as the young villain. Women are so often cast as nurturers, it's fun to see someone sink their teeth into being the bad guy, especially when the villain is interesting. The Craft does this as well. 3 of the members of the Coven turn on the 4th, making it an interesting take on the fickle nature of teenage friendships. I'm sure everyone can relate to the idea of a friend one day up and stop talking to you. Perhaps my favorite example is that of Carrie White. Carrie, obviously. Tortured by her religious mother and tormented by uncaring classmates, look, the suburbs breed monsters. I can tell you that. Carrie finally just snaps after a cruel prank and kills her bullies and her entire senior class. A little bit of an overkill. What she does is awful. Her grave is marked with a sign that says Carrie White burns in hell. And frankly, even she knew that there was nowhere else she could go after that. But we as a viewer feel sorry for her because we saw what led to that point. Horror is full of monsters that we feel sympathy for. We feel for the monster in Frankenstein, we felt for the Wolfman, and we feel for Carrie. Horror had morally gray characters and sympathetic villains way before HBO and AMC made it cool. And actually, that brings us to today. As I've said before, I think horror is having a mini renaissance. Old school scares came back instead of the studio-approved torture porn of Saw and Hostel. Honestly, at least old exploitation films were honest and actually pushing the envelope. We had 2 great horror movies starring women in 2009. Drag Me to Hell, an EC Comics style movie about a young woman trying to escape a Romani curse. And Jennifer's Body, the unfairly maligned at the time movie featuring Megan Fox as a high schooler turned succubus. But the great movies, the great roles for women in horror really didn't start to rear their head until 2014. The first breakout is Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, a movie about a mother battling literal and inner demons. This was followed by the Iranian vampire film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, directed by Anna Lily Amirpour. A tip, this movie pairs really well with the 2008 vampire film Let the Right One In. We then had The Witch in 2015, a visceral fable about Puritan New England, anchored by a stellar performance by Anya Taylor-Joy. Last year, we had a modern take on the rape-revenge genre, Revenge, written and directed by a woman. We had the Suspiria remake, which, hey, I liked. Jamie Lee Curtis returned as Laurie Strode in Halloween, and Toni Collette's barn burner robbed of an Oscar performance in Hereditary. A movie that continues the theme of women knowing something is wrong, but they are just labeled as crazy. We've even had great villain performances by Allison Williams in Get Out and Octavia Spencer in Ma. And just this year, we have had a bevy of female horror performances. Kea Scolodario battled gators in the creature feature Crawl. Florence Pugh battled depression, family tragedy, and bad boyfriends in Midsommar. Samara Weaving battled a weird rich family in Ready or Not. And Lupita Nyong'o battled an evil mirror image of herself in Us. And let me tell you, if she's not nominated for an Oscar for her dual performance, I'm going to be mad as her tether. And if there's one thing you cannot accuse horror of doing anymore, it's making women ineffective damsels. Though, they're still in distress. Horror is all about fear, and in many cases, facing your demons, and horror, for any and all of its faults, gives women just as much of an opportunity, if not more so, to be the protagonist of the story. We all battle our demons. We all have our fears. If anything, horror has given women some of the best fictional roles in recent memory for me. Sure, there's a lot of crap you have to wade through, but that's every genre. As far as I'm concerned, horror is a woman's genre. In fact, join me next month when I discuss women directors in horror. That's right, November is also Horror Month. Because there's never a bad time for horror in my book. Special thanks to DerryCAM, Derry Community Access Media, empowering independent voices. And if you want any horror recommendations this month or year-round, come find me at the Derry Public Library's information desk. See you next month.